Our guest tonight is Luigi Einaudi, and he is, I can say without exaggeration, one of the top experts on the Americas, on democracy in the Western Hemisphere, and on settling disputes among those democracies in the Western Hemisphere. He mediated agreements between Peru and Ecuador. He helped resolve border disputes between Honduras and El Salvador, between Honduras and Nicaragua, between Guatemala and Belize. After retiring as the U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States, the OAS elected him to the #2 position for a 5-year term. And this is the first and only time that a North American was ever elected to that post. After he finished it, there was even a move to make him Secretary General of the OAS. He was well thought of, as you can see from just that anecdote. He was once introduced by a Venezuelan lawmaker to the former Queen of Spain, and he was described in this way: "This North American knows more about us than we do." This evening, Ambassador Einaudi has agreed to focus on Venezuela, once a rich and functioning democracy, now an economic basket case and a political shambles. They had free elections in July with many safeguards so that you could actually vote and the vote would be counted. But then the current president, Nicolas Maduro, he had lost fair and square in this election. And then he declared himself the winner without proof. He is due to be inaugurated in January, 10 days before President Trump will be inaugurated. So Venezuela is likely to be on the agenda of the incoming Trump administration and on the agenda of its incoming Secretary of State, who at least been proposed, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. So the question tonight is there a path back to democracy for Venezuela? And I turn that question over to you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Roy. Thank you, members of the council here in Baltimore. A beautiful and a port city, so it's an international city quite as well. And I'm very pleased to be part of your activities and your history and to get a chance to talk to you about this nasty problem. 40 years ago, in 1984, I accompanied Congressman Benjamin Gilman, Republican of New York, and Michael Barnes, Democrat of Maryland, to Venezuela. Their bipartisan trip came in the midst of the violence and turmoil that was shaking Central America and the prolonged military rule that had spread through South America. I was at the time Director of Policy Planning for the Americas at the State Department, and I conceived the trip as a way to demonstrate that there was a path to democracy in Latin America. Since 1958, Venezuela had alternated powers every 5 years, almost like clockwork, between Acción Democrática, an anti-communist but socialist party and member of the Socialist International, and COPE, a Christian Democratic Party that was a member of the Christian Democratic International. And Venezuela, therefore, seemed to show that it was a stable and democratic party, two-system, miraculous, just like ours. And that it was possible, therefore, to be optimistic about our neighbors to the south. Over the last quarter century, however, an authoritarian and anti-US, profoundly anti-US regime that began with popular support has destroyed Venezuela's democracy, abused its oil economy, and driven more than 7 million Venezuelans into exile. I'm saying 7 million. Most of the current papers now say 8 million. But that regime has now really run out of steam. In the elections that Roy Gutman referred to in introducing me and the topic, the regime disqualified Maria Corina Machado, the very popular leading opposition candidate, and then engaged in really persistent and creative harassment of an unknown fill-in candidate. I mean, they didn't let him travel to campaign. They prevented people from registering to vote abroad, et cetera, et cetera. But they were met with equally persistent and inventive efforts by the opposition to make the vote count and work. There was a record-breaking turnout. The regime announced its official candidate had won a close vote, relatively close, 51 to 43, I think they announced. Yeah, we won't talk about current vote counts in the United States. But provided no documentation. The next day, however, to enormous surprise, the opposition was able to show official precinct returns for more than 80% of the precincts and show conclusively that they had won a better than 2-to-1 victory. And within a week, as that information was spread around, the whole world knew that Nicolas Maduro had lost to the previously unknown Edmundo González Urrutia. But Maduro has remained in power, responding to all pressures with naked oppression, clothed in really Orwellian manipulations of domestic legality. I have no answer to the question that Roy has posed for me tonight, whether there is a path back to democracy. In September, González fled to Spain, accused groundlessly of conspiracy, forgery, and sabotage. And we know historically that exile has never been very kind to those who seek power. Could something happen between now and next January when Venezuela's constitution calls for the inauguration of a new president? What are the regional dynamics? What is happening inside Venezuela? Will the election of Donald Trump in the United States make a difference? Venezuela's population is about the same as that of Texas, and its landmass is about a third larger than Texas. It has the world's largest proven petroleum reserves, 6 times those of the United States, and substantial deposits of iron ore, gold, bauxite, and diamonds. Venezuela is part of the Caribbean basin, and miraculously, I don't know, this is a line I once drew on the map, and here it reappears dramatically here, showing what I mean by the Caribbean basin. It is the third border of the United States. I mean, we're accustomed to thinking of a border to Canada and the border with Mexico, but this is just as much a border to the United States. It's an avenue. Germans during World War II sank an awful lot of shipping in this area until we got our act together. And as a matter of fact, there are still traces of US bases spread in these small Caribbean islands. I once had the ambassador of St. Lucia skip for joy when I was able to come up with a copy of the location of one of them. So this is really a strategic area. And don't miss Florida, which one could say is like a dagger pointed at the heart of Venezuela, with its 400,000 Venezuelan Americans, most of them voting US citizens. And we should not forget that as we think about what may happen. Okay, back to the question of democracy. A century ago, a Venezuelan writer argued that a dictator could be democratic if he imposed measures that were favorable to the disadvantaged masses. He called it democratic Caesarism. Now, after World War II, a Venezuelan president, Romulo Betancourt, supported democracy through the Organization of American States, and he sought to deny diplomatic recognition to any government issuing from a coup. Most countries rejected that at the time. It became known as the Betancourt Doctrine and was dormant in the archives of diplomacy until one of his successors as president of Venezuela, a friend of mine named Carlos Andrés Pérez, called for the OAS charter to be amended to require immediate collective suspension of diplomatic relations in case of a coup. Mexico immediately opposed any such action, citing the Estrada Doctrine, another one of these remote academic diplomatic doctrines, that no nation has the right to judge the politics of any other nation. I was ambassador to the OAS at the time, and I worked behind the scenes to suggest that a coup could meet an automatic response, but without a predetermined outcome. I hope that this more moderate position was one that the non-interventionists might be able to accept as a compromise. And indeed, Brazil's ambassador came up with sudden or irregular interruption of a democratic process as an interesting trigger, because it would eliminate the word coup, so it wouldn't offend all of our military brethren. And in fact, Brazil's move isolated the Mexicans and assured the substantial support of most of South America. And at this point, we naturally ran into one of the typical characteristic disasters of international meetings, because the Commonwealth Caribbean said, "Hey, you've left us out. We weren't consulted." And there was a tense negotiation with them, at the end of which they agreed to support this procedure in return for a paragraph in the resolution that called for, and I quote, "a set of proposals that will serve as incentives to preserve and strengthen democratic systems," unquote. Well, Resolution 1080, Representative Democracy, instructed the Secretary General to call for the immediate convocation of the Permanent Council in case of a sudden interruption. This made the response automatic, without delays or finger pointing. Unfortunately, again, as is fairly typical of our world, the package of positive measures called for by the Caribbean, the incentives, were never developed. In fact, funds for the OAS shrank even as the much ballyhooed democratic charter was adopted in 2001. And in addition, Latin America's pervasive social injustices brought the definition itself of democracy under fire. When societies open up to education and mass media, all kinds of ideas start bubbling up. until suddenly the discussion isn't just about elections or even freedom of speech or the press, but rather about social inclusion, workers' rights, the economy, and an infinite array of other matters. And ironically, it was yet another Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, who took the lead in articulating popular anger over these matters and undoing much of the work of his predecessor, Carlos Andrés Pérez. A fundamental mistake by Pérez opened the way for Chavez. In early 1989, Pérez introduced a series of austerity measures, including a hike in the price of gasoline. Several days of mass protests were repressed by military force. The turmoil was dubbed the Caracazo, for Caracas, the nation's capital. The Caracazo revealed that democracy in Venezuela had been really profoundly corrupted by the easy returns and socially divisive effects of the black gold of oil. The Caracazo delegitimized the governing system, which was shaken by 2 coup attempts, one of them by an unknown officer named Hugo Chavez. Another close friend of mine was serving as Mexico's ambassador to Venezuela at the time, and he wrote me, "These people are crazy. When they're accused of corruption, they answer, 'Of course I'm corrupt, but you're more corrupt than I am. I am bad, but you are worse than I am.' Before long," said my friend, wrote my friend, "they will all be swept away." And indeed they were. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president. And in the spirit of democratic Caesarism, Chavez led a charge for direct democracy, overcoming opposition to his redistributive policies from Venezuela's elite and from the many beneficiaries of the oil economy, including PDVSA, the national oil company, its unions, who in the privileged situation of oil were themselves rich and not really representing the laboring classes, and of course the establishment press. Chavez was detained in a 2002 coup that lasted 2 days, just long enough to be praised by the US government, in which I was not participating at the time. Then he returned to power, and he systematically eliminated institutional checks on executive authority while providing services to the many left behind by the oil economy. His regime drew on oil revenues to also provide cut-rate petroleum to friendly parties and governments in the region. Venezuela joined with Cuba in aggressively promoting ALBA. That's an acronym that means dawn in Spanish. ALBA is dawn, but it stands for Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples of Our America. And it was meant as a replacement for the traditional inter-American system. And denouncing representative democracy as fostering inequality, Chavez worked to undermine the regional jurisprudence supporting democracy and withdrew from the OAS, claiming that it reflected merely imperial domination from the United States. The relationship with Cuba that Chavez developed is not a normal diplomatic alliance, but one that involves Cuba in intimate internal security matters, military intelligence and control, and Cuban-style bloc surveillance, called Bolivarian circles in Venezuela. These colectivos, semi-official armed bands, are neither police nor military, but they do the thug work that enables the official uniformed services to remain relatively clean because others are doing the actual physical repression. The turmoil in Venezuela like that in Cuba before it, became is a source of repression at home and instability abroad. Migration from Venezuela, like population movements from Mexico, Central America's Northern Triangle, Haiti, and Cuba, has injected often intractable tensions into the domestic politics of all of the countries of the Caribbean Basin and beyond. Colombia alone has received more than 2.5 million Venezuelans. Peru, 1.5 million. Almost 4 million more are spread among more than 20 countries in the Americas and Europe. And smaller numbers are straining the capacity of even the small Caribbean neighbors of Venezuela. So the grand Bolivarian dreams of Chavez and his successors have now largely crumbled. Viewed in human terms, there is a war of attrition between Maduro and Venezuela's now largely exiled elite that is having tragic effects on the Venezuelan people. Viewed geopolitically, Venezuela's ties to China, Iran, and Russia have made Venezuela a pawn in the global rebalancing underway in the Middle East and with US allies in Europe and our rivals like China and Russia. Russia, China, and Cuba are now key to Maduro's survival. So where do we go from here? What happens next? The OAS is designed to enable cooperation among sovereigns with different interests, but its web of mutual support and obligation has become skeletal, fragmented by lack of common purpose and crippling reductions in resources. A special July 31 meeting of the OAS Permanent Council, i.e., called immediately after the Venezuelan elections, to consider a response, made clear that positive regional outcomes are not likely under current circumstances. 17 countries, a majority, did vote for resolutions seeking release of electoral data and protection for opposition candidates. But 11 abstained, and 5 countries did not even attend. The blocking minority was held together by opposition to what they said was interference in Venezuela's internal affairs. And these countries included much of CARICOM, the Commonwealth Caribbean, plus Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. A little remembered initiative of President Ronald Reagan offers some useful lessons about how a response might come. Reagan is, of course, remembered chiefly for intervention in the civil wars of Central America and hostility to Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. But 40 years ago, the United States also used trade and investment incentives to help stabilize the countries of Central America, then under threat from social tensions and communism. The 1983 Caribbean Basin Initiative, CBI, provided trade and investment incentives to the 7 countries of Central America, plus 16 island nations of the Caribbean. Duty-free access to the U.S. market for most goods stimulated trade and facilitated investment. Implementation had challenges, yes, especially for the smaller countries. But the absence of a mechanism to address spiraling oil prices also allowed Chavez's Petrocaribe initiative to later become a lifesaver for many CARICOM countries. And the CBI's impact was reduced over the years by the more open trading practices of the World Trade Organization and changing strategic concerns. Foreign aid dwindled and focused more narrowly on Central America's Northern Triangle countries and separately Haiti. Today's assistance programs, however, are often more declaratory than real. There is little strategic sense of fresh government money going into the region, except perhaps for counter-narcotics efforts. The United States has no vision for the Caribbean basin, even as our neighbors' struggles spill over onto us. One could almost call it strategic neglect. The need to cooperate on common issues is so great that failure to do so is deeply unsettling. The well-being and effective sovereignty of all the Caribbean basin's countries are being affected by transnational corruption and crime, including illegal narcotics and equally illegal arms flows, even when they're not directly related or linked to terrorism or existential security questions. And cooperation across borders is also required by climate change, with sea levels and hurricanes a particular problem for the Caribbean basin, including the shores of the US, as well as migration, trade, natural resources, tourism, and communications. Systematic cooperation on these problems would obviously benefit all of us, and all should participate. And depending on which elements are stressed and who they involved, there could be something in a comprehensive new CBI initiative for just about every problem and almost everyone in the political spectrum. But a fresh regional effort will not be easy. Wars outside the hemisphere and the problems associated with globalization and plain bad government have demoralized everyone. Beggar thy neighbor protectionism and trade controls have created arbitrary impediments, increased corruption, and induced waste. But times are what they are, and the political climate is not propitious for ambitious foreign programs to support democracy, even perhaps if they would help to stem migration. So let us now consider the interests of the countries who are affected by this crisis. As an aspirant global power, Brazil generally seeks to maintain a posture independent of traditional blocs. Brazil, believe it or not, American friends, maintains more embassies in the Caribbean than does the United States. Under President Bolsonaro, relations with Venezuela were strained. Under President Lula, they improved. One of Lula's closest advisors visited Venezuela both before and after the election. Brazil has been cautious in its response, but Venezuela, trying to break out of its growing international isolation after the election, last month sought membership in the BRICS. You know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Brazil opposed Venezuela's admission. Amorim testified before the Brazilian Senate that, and I quote, "Brazil believes BRIC members should be countries with influence that can represent the region. And Venezuela today does not meet these conditions." Colombia shares a long border with Venezuela. Colombia's internal wars spilled over into Venezuela. Now, Venezuelan migrants are flooding Colombia. The government of President Gustavo Petro reestablished relations with Venezuela 2 years ago, but has not defended Maduro's claim of victory and is almost forced to support negotiations. if only to reduce migrant pressures. In the tradition of the Estrada Doctrine, Mexico has long opposed passing judgment on the governments of other countries. Its own transition in September from AMLO to the smart lady probably made it easier for Mexico to keep a slightly lower profile than Colombia or Brazil. But Mexico has also not accepted Maduro's claims and has in the past facilitated conversations between Maduro and the opposition. CARICOM follows Venezuelan events closely and seeks strength in numbers. They are small, but often finds unified positions hard to achieve. And its countries and Haiti are major beneficiaries of Petrocaribe. And Trinidad and Tobago has joint offshore gas production with Venezuela. Turning to Europe, Spain has given refuge to Edmundo González Urrutia. The EU introduced sanctions against Venezuela as long ago as 2017, including an embargo on arms and a travel ban and an asset freeze on individuals and entities responsible for human rights violations and undermining democracy. And then there are Venezuela's allies. Foremost among these is Cuba, of course. Chavez considered Fidel a mentor, and Cuba today receives heavily subsidized oil in return for security and intelligence assistance many consider critical to Maduro's hold on power. Today, about 1/3 of Venezuela's outstanding national debt of about 150 billion is owed to China and Russia, many in the form of loan for oil deals. 2 Russian ships, the frigate Admiral Gorshkov and the oil tanker Academic Pashin, both in Russia's northern fleet, docked in the Venezuelan port of La Guaira in July after an initial stopover in Cuba, while conducting exercises in the Atlantic Ocean that Moscow said were to, quote, show the flag, unquote, in remote, important regions. China has invested tens of billions of dollars in Venezuela's petroleum sector and has become Venezuela's leading export market. The Chinese government recognized Maduro's re-election claims as soon as they were announced. Considering the fact that China's exposure economically to the many countries in the Western Hemisphere who are critical of Venezuela, from Argentina and Chile to Peru and Ecuador, this was probably not China's coolest moment. Last, but far from least, we have the United States. When Chavez first came to power, most observers thought he would moderate once in power and that we could ride him out. The U.S. Embassy was closed in 2019. Venezuela's economic collapse, caused by mismanagement and the fall of oil prices, was aggravated by the impact of the broad economic sanctions imposed when the Trump administration thought Maduro could be overthrown by a policy of, quote, maximum pressure, unquote. The willingness of the U.S. and some Venezuelan exiles to damage the Venezuelan economy through generalized sectoral sanctions that increased poverty convinced many inside Venezuela that the U.S. was no more interested in democracy than was Maduro and his cronies. Both Democrats and Republicans are hostile to the Maduro regime. A bipartisan approach would be possible with tailoring sanctions and developing new incentives. It would require mobilizing a variety of resources and applying them with at least a degree of multilateral acquiescence. And it would require an unusual ability to calibrate our actions in tune with what is happening inside Venezuela. And this is where I come up short. Chavez once invited me to come see his miracles for myself. I never did. And I don't live in Florida. Venezuela's constitution calls for a new government to take office in January 2025. Without changes to the electoral outcome, the current narco leadership will have succeeded in entrenching itself. If its leaders stay united, the regime may well prolong its hold and drive additional migrants into the neighborhood. On August 1, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico issued a joint communique calling on Venezuela to publish the election results by precinct. The same day, Venezuela's Catholic Bishops' Conference, and by the way, the Catholic Church, which once used to play a very visible political role throughout Latin America, which is really the source of 40% of today's Catholics in the world, has recently retreated into what is known as a pastoral concern, trying to avoid politics. But Venezuela's Catholic Bishops' Conference on August 1 formally supported all those inside and outside Venezuela who demand verification of the ballot results, unquote. Maduro's response was to reshuffle his cabinet. He named Diosdado Cabello his new Minister of Interior, Justice, and Peace. Diosdado Cabello, Minister of Justice, Interior, Justice, and Peace. Cabello amassed enormous power in the shadow of Chavez and is currently under a variety of sanctions from Canada, Colombia, the European Union, and the United States for drug trafficking. In 2017, the Miami Herald reported that a U.S. Department of Homeland Security memo reported that Cabello may have contacted unspecified Mexican nationals to discuss killing Senator Marco Rubio, who's apparently now going to be President Trump's Secretary of State. In 2020, the Department of State, my old department, offered $10 million. State Department doesn't have millions, but in any case, the Department of State offered $10 million for information leading to the arrest and or conviction for drug trafficking and narcoterrorism of Mr. Cabello. Today, threats of violence and intimidation hang over Venezuela. At U.S. Southern Command headquarters outside Miami, demonstrators are asking for military action. Others talk of finding specialized U.S. security contractors to decapitate the Venezuelan regime. Inside Venezuela, protesters seem cowed by the repression, but some are still hoping for a new Caracazo to destabilize the new regime as it did the old, while Maria Corina Machado and González Urrutia try to keep peaceful hopes alive from hiding and from Spain, respectively. The best hope is that Venezuelans, regime and opposition, will negotiate the composition of a new government. But changes just in who is in office will not clean up this mess. Links to the democratic world have been lost or abandoned and will need to be rebuilt. New balances will have to be found between returning emigres and those who stayed behind. Fresh sanctions, particularly if aimed at individuals who deserve them, could conceivably still aid post-electoral adjustments in Venezuela. But sanctions are difficult to lift, and the need for incentives is likely to increase. The Biden administration concluded that sectoral sanctions are not efficient for regime change. that they stimulate migration by hurting the population. Last month, the Biden administration renewed General License 41, which allows Chevron to continue its activities in Venezuela. That was immediately denounced by many leading Republicans. The incoming Trump administration will probably revisit efforts to fracture the regime through both increased pressure and efforts to negotiate a transition. So far, Maduro has been consistently underestimated. And today, though his international isolation is greater than ever, and though he must fear, I certainly would if I were in his place, that he could become a victim of geopolitical shifts among his allies, he is pinning his hopes for coexistence in exchange for oil supplies and stability on migration. I do not know what is happening behind the scenes in either Venezuela or Florida, but I do know that only Venezuelans can build democracy in Venezuela, but they will need help. At stake is everything from personal freedom and corruption inside Venezuela to regional migration and world trade in oil and illegal drugs. Working with others, the United States could provide the mix of sanctions and personal and institutional incentives needed to facilitate a fresh beginning for Venezuela and the Caribbean basin as a whole. What will be required above all is imagination and commitment from all concerned, and the United States will have to show unusual interest in its own neighborhood, economically and multilaterally, as well as politically. Thank you very much.
How do you expect from your contacts with Rubio himself and with others that in the surroundings, how do you expect that they will manage this problem? In fact, how do you expect they're going to manage the world?
I have only met Senator Rubio once. I admit it was over lunch, and I think there were just 3 of us. And I was intent on getting him to lift a hold he had on the nomination of one of my colleagues for a senior position. I succeeded in convincing him, or at least he didn't agree, but the next day he lifted. I have a very high opinion of Rubio's intelligence. He was able to not only just follow, but to anticipate every line of argument that I developed. And it struck me that he had an almost instinctive ability to avoid shoals, to find the right way to go that would bring a reasonable consensus. Clearly, Venezuela is extraordinarily important to him and to his constituents. And he has been very much caught up in the lead to and the results of the Venezuelan election. He was very sharp in denouncing the Biden administration policies, in easing some restrictions on Venezuela in return for holding the election, which of course he said he knew they would always steal, which at the same time, he has been totally negative when asked about any kind of military activity, and has said that there is no one in positions of authority that would consider that. I pray that that is a genuine statement, because any major military activity with regard to Venezuela would be extraordinarily costly, both humanly and in every other way. That is not to exclude the fact that there will be crazies who could try something. That has happened in our relations with Cuba among certain Cuban exile groups, and it has already happened with certain groups with regard to Venezuela. But I assume that those, if they happen, will be freelancing froth and not serious policy concern. What the new administration will do is, for me, a source of conjecture and speculation. I mean, I don't know. I am not close to anybody in the Trump camp. I do think that there is likely to be something of a reorientation inward by the administration when it comes to foreign affairs generally. I think that is the real meaning behind the criticism of NATO and criticisms of U.S. overextension abroad. Many of us are, in fact, tired of such overextensions. Now, that can be linked to what has been a strand in some conservative thinking, which is the need to focus more on our own neighborhood. And one of the things that Rubio has argued very strongly is that the combination of Venezuelan tyranny, migration at the American border, narcotics flowing into our country are all a sign that the United States has been spending its resources far away without worrying about its own home problems. And that sounds rather Trumpian also. So that if you think about that, I could imagine a situation in which the signals were to go out to China and Russia, stay away. We'll be less harsh in what we do on your borders if you are less harsh in what you do on our borders. I have no idea. But I do think that even minimal adjustments in the support that they provide to Venezuela might have an impact. I think more important than that will be another issue, and that is the issue of incentives. I keep coming back to incentives instead of punishments. We like to talk about punishing people with sanctions. We'll deny them this, we'll deny them that. What the Caribbean had asked for in that resolution on democracy, when they asked for incentives, was for more support from the big rich countries for training, for cooperation, for building up professional contacts so as to be able to face the problems of the modern world. I am convinced that if there were a more effective international cooperation on elections and other things, that would help, and that's certainly something Venezuela needs, and I've gone on forever. I'm not a filibusterer, I hope.
Spain has an awful lot of influence on Latin America due to history. And I'm just wondering what their relationship is and what their philosophies are towards Venezuela today.
Spain probably would just be a poor European country were it not for the fact that it has a former empire and that it can talk about Hispanidad and have the pride that comes also, by the way, with democracy. Now, Spain is now one of Venezuela's biggest export partners. And so they have economic ties that they clearly are going to want to preserve, and that will, to some extent, help the authorities in Caracas. On the other hand, Spain also is not only hosting the president-elect, but has recognized him as president-elect and is allowing him to do a lot of political work. I don't know how well that is received here in the United States. My old boss, Henry Kissinger, once told the Spaniards that we didn't need help to conduct our foreign policy. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And I think that probably remains something of an attitude at the political levels. And it certainly is also an attitude at the political levels in much of Latin America, which does not particularly want to be reminded of the colonial past.
How can or will Venezuela rebuild its petroleum industry? And then this is something I'm adding here. You talked about incentives. Is that something that the United States can use, incentivizing the rebuilding of their petroleum industry to kind of promote democracy?
Clearly, the Biden administration believes that buying petroleum from Venezuela through Chevron is an incentive and is a positive step. And Chevron is, of course, paying taxes to Venezuela. And if Venezuela has minimal good management, which it hasn't necessarily had, they can reinvest and do some work to rebuild their petroleum. Write that larger, and obviously you can see something happening along those lines. I would say, however, that it is inconceivable that the incoming U.S. government would follow such a policy if Maduro remains in power.
Can you discuss how the stresses, political and humanitarian, in Venezuela are impacting the U.S.'s southern border, and what the United States can or should do to stem this flow, and what it can do in cooperation with the OAS?
Well, the first thing to do with regard to the OAS is use it a little bit. We haven't been very active, and that is not fair because there are other countries, other governments who also don't particularly want to use the OAS. Part of that is because the current OAS Secretary General has gone beyond the normal pattern for a international civil servant, and has been very partisan, very politicized against Maduro. And the non-interventionist crowd, which is still in control of most Latin American foreign ministries, thinks that that is proof of U.S. dominance. So even though the U.S. isn't using it, they're not using it, and the OAS is in fairly bad shape. Even though I would note that one of its advantages is that it is an organization that is made up of the countries of this hemisphere. That is to say, the extraneous interests that are represented, say, at the Universal United Nations, where you have countries like China and Russia vetoing UN assistance to Haiti, would not exist if you were to work through and with the OAS. But to the person's question, which had to do with migration, I think one of the tragedies of this election having gone so badly is that many Venezuelans were ready to return. And I think that a democratic outcome, a change in regime in Venezuela, would in fact draw many Venezuelans back to Venezuela. And that would make an enormous difference for Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and so forth, and would probably reduce some of the strain at our border. Looked at cumulatively, I'm not sure that the Venezuelan migration to the US has been all that negative. Consider the fact that it has been going on for 24, 25 years, and that the concentration in Miami is a sign of the fact that much of it is the Venezuelan elite and upper class, which has moved to Miami, and of course it has brought with it substantial financial capacities as well as its laundry. So I think the bigger problem in terms of migration for the United States is not whether or not to build a wall. I think walls actually are fine. But if you don't want a wall to imprison yourself and your own people, you need gates in those walls for you to go out and for others to come in. And there you need rules. And that is the one thing that we haven't had for 30 or 40 years in a consistent fashion.
I lived in Venezuela a million years ago in 68 and 69 and found the people to be patriotic, pro-US, well-educated, and I maintained some of those contacts. And they were still up until the late 90s that. Does any of that reservoir of goodwill still exist in the country?
I don't know. I think it does. It does in many ways, in many areas, even though I think these have been very hard years, and I think, in fact, the policy of maximum pressure that was adopted in the expectation that it wouldn't have to last. See, that's the irony. The Trump people were convinced, and if you follow Venezuela, then you would probably have followed the people on Wall Street and elsewhere. They were convinced that by applying maximum pressure, that there was no way that the Venezuelan government would resist. And people on Wall Street were, in fact, already, there are articles you can still find on the web, where they're discussing how to divvy up the repayments of Venezuela's debt. They were so optimistic. When that didn't happen, when the Venezuelan government was able to continue to place its oil using various subterfuges, the Russian fleet, and Iran, all kinds of things, plus the internal control that the Cubans helped to provide, and the policy stayed, it really hit the Venezuelan people who were left behind hard. And I think that it contributed to the out-migration, and it left us all stuck in a situation where, as I suggested, a number of people felt we really weren't all that committed to a democratic outcome after all if we were inflicting such pain. That said, you know, I am an American nationalist. I'm an American. I believe in this country, and I believe that we attract all of these migrants because they still believe that life is best here. And that means that even for people that can't get here, they still have a reservoir of pro-American feeling.
On the Venezuelan-Guyana border, there is an oil reservoirs, and Venezuela is threatening to attack Guyana to take some of that land back. What is your view of what's likely to happen?
The general consensus among the people who have been following it more closely than I have is that this was largely the threats from Venezuela were largely a ploy to stir up nationalism and benefit them in the election, which ultimately, of course, failed. I suspect that that Guyana has the capacity, and now that's also beginning to benefit from oil monies itself, to improve its defenses. We are committed to trying to help them. I don't expect this to break into anything serious anytime soon.
Thank you so much for this very complete overview of Venezuela and the grim state it's in right now and the grim hopes for the future. But I think you've laid out all the possible avenues of development, and I only hope that they turn out better than you've predicted. Thank you so much.